Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I met my ex-husband when I was 23 and working at a local bank. He was this charming guy who came in every Friday to deposit his paycheck from the construction company where he worked. We started talking, then dating, and within 2 years we were married. He always talked about wanting a big family, how he couldn't wait to be a dad and teach his kids everything he knew. When our son was born, he was over the moon. He carried pictures of the baby everywhere and would show them to anyone who'd listen. He was actually a decent father in those early years, always wanting to help with diaper changes and getting up for night feedings. But when our son got older and our marriage started having problems, his personality began to change. The issues started small. He'd make little comments about how our son looked more like me than him, or joke about how the mailman was awfully friendly. I brushed it off at first because I figured he was just being stupid, but then it got worse. When our son turned 5 and I found out I was pregnant again, I was excited. We'd been trying for another baby for over a year. When I told him the news, he seemed happy at first, but then something shifted. Maybe it was because our marriage was already rocky, or maybe he was just looking for reasons to start fights. But he began making these awful jokes. For the first time it happened, we were at dinner and our son was telling us about his day at school. My ex-husband made some comment about wondering if this new baby would actually look like him this time. When I asked what he meant by that, he just brushed it off and said something about genetics. I told him I wasn't amused by whatever he was trying to say. He just shrugged and went back to eating, but I could see this smirk on his face, like he thought he was being clever. The second time was worse. We were at the grocery store and I was looking at baby clothes when he walked up behind me and made a comment about hoping this kid didn't have the neighbor's eyes like the last one. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked over the clothing rack and told him not to say that again. I made it clear I meant it. He tried to play it off like he was just kidding around and said I was being too sensitive. I told him that wasn't kidding, that was him accusing me of cheating, and I wouldn't stand for it. He held up his hands like he was innocent, but that same stupid smirk was still there. The third time was the last straw. We were at home watching TV when our son went to bed. I was folding baby clothes I'd bought that day when he decided to open his mouth again and ask when the real father was gonna start helping with baby expenses. I dropped the tiny shirt I was holding and looked him dead in the eyes. I told him to say it again, to say it one more time. He started to repeat himself, but I cut him off and told him to go ahead and make his little joke one more time. He must have seen something in my face because he actually looked a little nervous and said he didn't mean anything by it. That's when I told him I'd made up my mind about something. I explained that when they brought me that form at the hospital, that blank line that says, "Father," I was going to put unknown. His face went white and he said, "I wouldn't do that." I told him not to believe me if he didn't want to, but to try me. He insisted he was the father and that I knew he was the father. I asked him if I really knew that because, according to him, I apparently slept around with mailmen and neighbors. So how would I know for sure? I had never cheated on him. Not once. Not even close. He was definitely the father of both our kids, and he knew it. But I was so tired of his nasty implications and his need to make me feel small that I didn't care anymore. He said I was being crazy. I pointed out that I wasn't the one who kept suggesting his pregnant wife was cheating. He insisted he was just joking, but I told him here was my joke father. Unknown. I asked him how that was for funny. He spent the rest of my pregnancy trying to backtrack and apologize, but I wasn't having it. Every time he'd try to smooth things over, I'd remind him of what was coming. He'd say I'd made my point and ask if I was really going to do this. I'd tell him to keep testing me and find out. When I went into labor, he drove me to the hospital and stayed by my side through the whole thing. When our daughter was born, he was crying and telling me how beautiful she was and how sorry he was for everything. He said she was perfect and looked just like me. I pointed out how funny it was that he was so sure she was his now. The nurse came in with the paperwork, including the birth certificate form. My ex-husband watched nervously when she handed it to me. The nurse told me to just fill out what I could and said she'd come back for it later. I took the pen and started filling it out. When I got to the father line, I paused and looked at my ex-husband. He was practically holding his breath. I asked him if he had any last jokes he wanted to make. He begged me not to do it and said he was sorry. Really sorry. I looked at him for a long moment, then wrote unknown in big clear letters. He spent months trying to get his name added to the birth certificate, dealing with lawyers and court dates and paternity tests. It cost him thousands of dollars and endless headaches. We divorced about a year later. The whole birth certificate thing didn't cause our divorce, but it sure didn't help our already broken marriage. For 15 years, I've tried my best to maintain a good relationship with my husband's family. My sister-in-law can be challenging sometimes, but she's married to my brother, so I've always made an effort to keep things peaceful. We're all in our 40s now, supposedly mature adults, but some people never really grow out of certain behaviors. The whole mess started about 6 months ago when my sister-in-law suggested we all go on a cruise together. Just the four of us, me, my husband, her, and my brother. It sounded like a wonderful idea. We rarely get to spend quality time together as couples, and a 7-day Caribbean cruise seemed like the perfect opportunity to bond and create some good memories. She texted me about finding an amazing cruise deal for 7 days with stops at 3 different islands. I told her it sounded great and asked when she was thinking of going. She suggested March, saying the weather would be perfect then. My husband and I were immediately excited about the idea. We started talking about excursions, what to pack, and how much vacation time we'd need to request from work. She seemed just as excited and told us she was going to book their cabin right away. She mentioned that she was booking their cabin that day and suggested I should probably book ours soon since the good cabins go fast. I told her I would, but that I just needed to check our work schedules first, and asked for a few days. That was my mistake. I should have booked immediately, but work had been crazy. We were in the middle of a major project deadline, and I was pulling 12-hour days. I figured I had a little time since it was still several months away. I assumed she understood I was just busy and would book when things calmed down at work. About 2 weeks later, I finally had a chance to look at the cruise website. I was getting ready to book when my phone buzzed with a text from her. She told me she had great news. She had run into the Johnsons at the grocery store and told them about our cruise. She said they were so excited and had already booked their cabin. Then she mentioned calling the Millers, who also wanted to come, and had booked that morning. I stared at my phone in complete shock. The Johnsons? The Millers? I had no idea who these people were. In all the years I'd known my sister-in-law, she had never once mentioned anyone by those names. I texted back asking who the Johnsons and Millers were. She explained they were friends from their neighborhood that they'd known for years. She said they were fun people and that I'd love them. I reminded her that I thought this was going to be just the four of us. She admitted that yes, it was originally planned that way, but said the more the merrier and that it would be much more fun with a bigger group. My stomach dropped. This wasn't the first time she had done something like this. Over the years, there had been countless dinners that suddenly became group events. We'd show up expecting a quiet meal with just the four of us, only to find ourselves at a table with 6 or 8 people we'd never met before. The pattern was always the same. She'd get excited talking to these other couples, they'd dominate the conversation with inside jokes and shared memories, and my husband and I would sit there feeling like awkward outsiders. We'd smile politely, try to contribute to conversations about people and events we knew nothing about, and end up paying for expensive meals while feeling completely left out. My husband walked into the room and immediately noticed my expression. I explained that she had invited 2 other couples to the cruise, people we didn't know at all. His face fell. He sat down heavily on the couch next to me and said he didn't want to spend a week trapped on a ship with strangers, especially after all our conversations about wanting quality family time together. He pointed out how she always acted when her other friends were around, saying we'd be completely ignored. He was right, and we both knew it. The cruise was expensive. We were looking at nearly $3,000 total between the cabin, flights, and excursions. Taking a week off work would mean using most of our vacation time for the year. The idea of spending that much money and time to feel like outsiders at our own family vacation was unbearable. I texted her back, trying to be diplomatic, saying I thought we were going to pass on the cruise but hoped she had a great time with her friends. My phone rang within minutes. She demanded to know what I meant about passing and why we would cancel. I explained that we were really looking forward to spending time with just the four of us, and having other couples there changed the whole dynamic. She said she didn't understand why that was such a big deal and said they were wonderful people. She called me ridiculous for being upset about it. I tried to explain that it wasn't about whether they were wonderful or not. We didn't know them, and we had made these plans thinking it would be family time. She got defensive and asked if I was saying she couldn't invite her own friends. I told her maybe she should have discussed it with us first before inviting anyone else. She accused me of being controlling and said she couldn't believe I was being so petty over meeting new people. The conversation went downhill from there. She couldn't understand why we'd have a problem with her inviting strangers to what we thought was a family trip. To her, it was no big deal. To us, it felt like a complete betrayal of what we'd planned together. My brother called later that evening, clearly having been filled in on the situation. He mentioned that she was really upset about the cruise situation and asked if we couldn't just go anyway, saying they were nice people. I told him I was sure they were nice, but we weren't comfortable spending that kind of money to vacation with people we'd never met. We had been looking forward to family time. He made excuses for her, saying she just got excited and wanted to include everyone, and that we knew how she was. I told him that was exactly the problem. She always did this, and we always ended up feeling left out. We were tired of it. He tried to guilt me, saying she had put a lot of work into planning this and asking me not to be like this. I pointed out that she had put work into planning her vacation, not ours. She had changed our plans without asking us. The whole family got involved eventually. Some sided with us, understanding that springing strangers on people for an expensive vacation was inconsiderate. Others thought we were being antisocial and should just go along with it to keep the peace. The pressure campaign lasted for weeks. My sister-in-law kept sending me articles about the cruise, destinations, and photos of the ship, trying to tempt us to change our minds. She'd text about how disappointed the Johnsons and Millers were that we weren't coming, like we'd somehow committed to spending our vacation with people we'd never even spoken to. She started complaining to other family members that we were ruining everyone's fun and being selfish. She told people we were jealous that she had more friends than us and that we couldn't handle not being the center of attention. The twisted version of events she was spreading made us sound petty and antisocial. I'd had enough. I sent her a long message explaining that I needed her to stop trying to convince us to go. I told her we had made our decision and weren't changing our minds. I pointed out that this wasn't the first time she had done this, that she had a pattern of inviting people to events without discussing it first, then getting upset when we felt uncomfortable. I explained how we always ended up feeling like outsiders when she brought her friends along, and how we were tired of paying good money to feel left out from conversations and activities. I reminded her that we had talked about this being family time, and that springing four strangers on us for a week-long vacation was not okay. She responded with anger, accusing me of trying to control her friendships and being jealous of her social life. She said we were being dramatic and that normal people would be excited to meet new friends. She said that we were the problem, and that everyone else thought we were being ridiculous. 3 weeks before the cruise departure, I found out the real reason behind her anger. My brother let slip that she had bragged to the Johnsons and Millers about how successful and well-traveled we were. She had painted us like this glamorous couple who could afford luxury vacations and expensive dinners. She wanted to show us off to her friends like we were some kind of status symbol. When we refused to go, it made her look bad in front of people she was trying to impress. She couldn't admit that she had overstepped by inviting them without asking us first. So instead, she had to make us the villains who were too snobby to meet her friends. The cruise came and went. We spent that week at home enjoying some quiet time together and catching up on projects around the house. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law's perfect vacation wasn't so perfect after all. My brother told me that the Johnsons and Millers kept asking about us throughout the trip. They had been told so much about us that our absence was noticeable and awkward. My sister-in-law had to keep making excuses for why we weren't there, and eventually had to admit that we had backed out because she'd invited them without telling us first. The other couples were mortified to learn they had been the cause of a family conflict. They felt terrible that their presence had driven us away from a family vacation. By the end of the cruise, the atmosphere was tense and uncomfortable for everyone involved. When they got back, my sister-in-law was furious with us for embarrassing her in front of her friends. She blamed us for ruining her vacation and making her look bad. She couldn't see that the whole mess was her own doing. A month later, when we ran into the Johnsons at a local restaurant, they recognized us from photos my sister-in-law had shown them and came over to introduce themselves. They were lovely people, and they apologized for the whole situation. They explained that they'd had no idea we didn't know about their invitation to the cruise. My sister-in-law had made it sound like we were all planning it together and were excited to meet them. When they learned the truth, they felt used and manipulated. The Johnsons told us they'd tried to stay friendly with my sister-in-law after the cruise, but she kept making negative comments about us and trying to get them to take her side in the conflict. They eventually distanced themselves from her because they found her behavior inappropriate and manipulative. 6 months later, my sister-in-law still barely speaks to us. She's convinced that we're the ones who were wrong, and she tells anyone who will listen about how we ruined her vacation and embarrassed her in front of her friends. She's never once acknowledged that inviting people to someone else's planned vacation without asking might have been inconsiderate. My husband and I are planning our own cruise for next year. Just the two of us this time, with no surprise guests and no family drama. I bought my house some years ago, and what made it special wasn't even the house itself. It was the magnificent tree in the front yard. This tree was a beauty, about 40 years old, with a thick trunk and branches that spread wide enough to shade half my lawn. The previous owners had taken great care of it, and I planned to do the same. Everything was perfect until our homeowner association got a new board member. Karen lived just 2 houses down from me, and from day one of her election, she made it clear that my tree was her enemy. She complained constantly that the tree was way too close to the property line, and insisted that the roots were probably damaging everyone's foundations. When I told her it had been there for 40 years without any problems and that the previous inspection showed it was perfectly healthy, she dismissed my concerns. She argued that it needed to go because it dropped leaves everywhere and blocked sunlight from her garden. I tried to be reasonable. I hired 2 different professional arborists to inspect the tree, and both gave it clean bills of health. The reports clearly showed that the tree was structurally sound, properly maintained, and posed no danger to surrounding properties. I presented these reports to the homeowner association board during their monthly meeting. The board president looked over the paperwork and told me that based on these professional assessments, the tree could definitely stay. He said it was a valuable addition to the neighborhood. But Karen wasn't done. She started a personal campaign against me and my tree. Every morning when I left for work, she'd be standing in her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at the tree like it had personally wronged her. She left passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox about property maintenance responsibilities and consideration for neighbors. She even went door to door trying to get other residents to complain about the tree. Her efforts backfired spectacularly. Most of my neighbors actually loved the tree. One neighbor told her she was kidding and that the tree was gorgeous, explaining that it kept her electric bill down in summer. Another neighbor said that when Karen came by asking him to sign some petition, he told her to mind her own business. A third neighbor mentioned that Karen was just jealous because her yard looked like a golf course with no personality whatsoever. Last month, I had to travel across the country for a 4-day work conference. My next-door neighbor kindly agreed to keep an eye on my house while I was gone. I figured the biggest worry would be whether I remembered to water my plants before leaving. On the second day of my trip, while I was sitting in a boring presentation about quarterly projections, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. She enlisted her cousin, who apparently did some kind of yard work, and convinced him to cut down my tree while I wasn't there to stop them. According to the police report I read later, Karen parked her car on the street near my property and sat inside talking on her phone, supervising the whole operation like some kind of tree destruction foreman. Her cousin didn't have proper licensing for tree removal, but Karen assured him she had authority from the homeowner association. Here's where Karen's plan went sideways. Her cousin clearly had no idea what he was doing. Instead of carefully removing the tree section by section, he made one cut at the base and let the whole thing fall. The massive oak came crashing down directly onto the trunk of Karen's car, with Karen still inside it. The impact shattered her rear window, and the tree's weight crushed the roof down to the seat level. Karen ended up with whiplash, several cuts from the broken glass, and bruising across her back and shoulders. The fire department had to cut her out of the wreckage. She was taken to the hospital as a precaution, treated, and released the same day. When I returned home from my conference, my front yard looked like a crime scene that had been cleaned up. The tree was completely gone, leaving only a stump and torn-up grass where the massive trunk had been dragged away. There was no debris, no sawdust, nothing. Just empty space where my beautiful tree used to stand. I called the police, confused and furious, and they directed me to come down to the station for a statement. The officer who briefed me explained everything that had happened while I was gone. He told me that my neighbor and her cousin had trespassed on my property and illegally removed the tree. Multiple neighbors had witnessed the incident and given statements. The cousin had admitted he didn't have proper licensing for tree work. When I asked if Karen had claimed I gave her permission, the officer explained that she had told them she had authority from the homeowner association to remove dangerous trees. He said they had contacted the board president, who confirmed that was completely false. I explained that I had never given anyone permission to touch my tree and that 2 professional arborists had recently certified it as healthy and safe. The officer noted all of this in his report. 2 days later, I found an invoice from the homeowner association in my mailbox. They were billing me $3,500 for emergency tree removal, debris cleanup, and vehicle towing services. The letter said that as the property owner, I was responsible for all costs related to the incident. I stared at the bill in disbelief. They wanted me to pay for cleaning up Karen's illegal mess. I was being charged for the destruction of my own property by someone who had no right to be on my land in the first place. Before I could even call the homeowner association to dispute the bill, my phone rang. It was a lawyer claiming to represent Karen. He said his client had sustained significant injuries due to the negligent maintenance of my tree, and they were prepared to file suit for medical expenses and property damage. I told him his client had illegally cut down my tree while trespassing on my property, and that she was lucky I didn't sue her. When he argued that the tree was clearly dangerous if it fell and injured someone, I pointed out that it only fell because his client hired an unlicensed hack to cut it down improperly. I hung up and immediately called my own lawyer. 3 days later, Karen showed up at my front door wearing an obvious fake neck brace and leaning heavily on a pair of crutches she clearly didn't need. Her performance was so over the top that I almost laughed. She declared dramatically that she could have died because of my negligence, insisting that the tree was a death trap waiting to happen. I reminded her that she had illegally destroyed a healthy, professionally inspected tree and had no one to blame but herself. She threatened that her lawyer said she had an excellent case and that I'd be hearing from them very soon. She hobbled away dramatically, making sure to wince loudly with each step. My lawyer moved fast. Within a week, he filed a countersuit against Karen that included reimbursement for the $3,500 cleanup bill the homeowner association had tried to stick me with. Karen's lawyer took one look at the police report, witness statements, and arborist reports, then promptly dropped her case. Karen decided to represent herself in court, which turned out to be a spectacular mistake. She filed her paperwork incorrectly multiple times, missing deadlines and submitting forms to the wrong departments. The judge eventually warned her about wasting the court's time with frivolous motions. Meanwhile, the homeowner association board held an emergency meeting. The president called me personally to apologize. He said they had no idea Karen was planning something like this, explained that the board never authorized any tree removal, and announced they were removing her from her position immediately. The board agreed to pay for a replacement tree and formally apologized for the harassment I'd endured. They also agreed to cover the legal fees associated with fighting the fraudulent cleanup bill. When our court date finally arrived, the judge reviewed all the evidence and witness statements. The ruling was swift and decisive. Karen was found entirely at fault for the incident. She was ordered to pay me almost $10,000 in damages and court costs, covering everything from the value of my mature oak tree to my legal fees. Karen tried to file an insurance claim for her car and medical expenses. The insurance company denied everything because she was injured while committing an act of vandalism on someone else's property. Karen attempted to appeal the court's decision, but her appeal was rejected for being improperly filed. Apparently, representing yourself in court is harder than it looks on television. Today there's a beautiful new oak tree planted in my front yard. When I saw the posting for an admin/receptionist position at Peaceful Gardens Cemetery, I figured it would be quiet, respectful work helping families during their most difficult times. The job posting seemed straightforward enough. Answer phones, greet visitors, handle basic administrative tasks. Nothing too complicated. What they didn't mention was that I'd be walking into a workplace run by the most controlling micromanagers I've ever encountered. My first week went smoothly. The cemetery had implemented strict protocols due to the pandemic, so we kept the main entrance locked. Families had to ring the doorbell, and I would greet them and direct them to the appropriate family service advisor. The family service advisors were good people doing important work, but they were absolutely swamped. Between meeting with grieving families, handling paperwork, coordinating with funeral homes, and managing burial logistics, they barely had time to breathe. Since we had caller ID, I could see when families were calling and would answer the phone to help direct them to the right person. If a family service advisor was in the middle of comforting a widow or explaining burial options to a devastated father, I'd take messages or handle simple scheduling requests. It seemed like common sense to me. These families were going through the worst day of their lives, and the last thing they needed was to be put on hold or have their calls go unanswered. I also started helping with appointment scheduling when the family service advisors got backed up. They'd give me grateful smiles and whisper their thanks when I'd handle a scheduling call while they were dealing with an emotional family conference. The work felt meaningful, and I thought I was being genuinely helpful. That all changed 3 weeks into the job when my manager called a team meeting. There were 5 of us crammed into the small conference room. Myself, 2 family service advisors, my direct supervisor, and the general manager. I expected maybe some updates about new policies or recognition for how well we've been handling the increased workload. Instead, the general manager launched straight into what felt like a personal attack. She told us there were serious issues with job responsibilities and that some people weren't doing their actual jobs. I looked around, wondering who was in trouble. Then she looked directly at me. She said I was hired as an admin/receptionist, but I was doing everyone else's work instead, and that wasn't acceptable. I apologized and explained that I thought I was being helpful since the family service advisors seemed really busy, so I was just trying to support them. She said that was exactly the problem. I was answering phones that the family service advisors should be answering, and they had caller ID for a reason so they could see who was calling and decide whether to pick up. My supervisor added that I shouldn't be answering the door for appointments either, because each family service advisor should greet their own families. I tried to explain that sometimes the advisors were in the middle of meetings with other families, and I didn't think it was appropriate to interrupt them when someone was crying about their mother's burial arrangements. But the general manager insisted they could manage their own schedules. She emphasized that I absolutely should not be doing any appointment scheduling because that was their job, even if it meant they fell behind on paperwork or ran late to funerals. The absurdity hit me like a brick wall. They were telling me that family service advisors should potentially be late to funerals because they had to answer their own phones and schedule their own appointments. These were people's final goodbyes we were talking about. I asked if they wanted me to just sit at my desk and not help when families were calling or when the door needed to be answered. The general manager said I was hired to do administrative work and reception work, not to manage other people's responsibilities. She slid a piece of paper across the table with my actual job description and told me to stick to it. I read through the list: data entry, filing, answering general inquiries, busy work that could keep me occupied but wouldn't actually help anyone. I told them I understood and would stick to my assigned duties. That's exactly what I did. The next day, I came in and sat at my desk. When the phone rang, I let it ring. When families knocked on the door, I continued typing. When family service advisors looked at me desperately while they juggled 3 different crying families while their phones rang off the hook, I just smiled and returned to my filing. It was brutal to watch. Families had to wait outside in the cold while their assigned advisor finished up with someone else. Calls went to voicemail constantly. The family service advisors started looking frazzled and exhausted, staying late to catch up on the scheduling they now had to handle themselves. I felt bad for the families. One elderly man stood outside for 20 minutes because his family service advisor was dealing with a complicated burial situation and couldn't break away to answer the door. I watched him through the window, shifting his weight and checking his watch, clearly confused about why no one was helping him. But I followed orders. I did exactly what they told me to do and nothing more. 2 weeks later, I got called into another meeting. This time it was just me, my supervisor, and the general manager. The general manager said we needed to talk about my performance because I wasn't answering phones or helping families at the door, and several people had complained about poor service. I told them I was doing exactly what they had told me to do, reminding them that they said I shouldn't answer the phones because the family service advisors should handle their own calls. My supervisor said that families were waiting too long and I needed to be more responsive. I explained that they had literally told me not to do those things and said it wasn't my job. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app, where I'd written down everything from the previous meeting. I read back their exact words about how I was hired as an admin/receptionist, not to manage other people's responsibilities, and that the family service advisors should answer their own phones, greet their own appointments, and handle their own scheduling, even if it meant falling behind on paperwork or being late to funerals. The general manager said they obviously expected me to use some common sense about when to help. I pointed out that they had given me a written job description and told me to stick to it, so I had been doing exactly that. My supervisor accused me of being difficult and not showing initiative. I explained that I was being consistent with their direct instructions and they couldn't tell me not to do something and then get upset when I didn't do it. The general manager stood up and said this wasn't working out. She claimed my attitude was problematic and I wasn't a good fit for their team environment. I asked if this was because I had followed their explicit instructions. She told me they were going to have to let me go and that today would be my last day. I wasn't even surprised at that point. The whole situation had been so absurd that getting fired for doing exactly what they asked felt like the perfect ending to this comedy of errors. I said that was fine, but I wanted it documented that I was being terminated for following the direct instructions they had given me in writing. I gathered my things while they processed my final paperwork. But when I was leaving, one of the family service advisors pulled me aside and quietly told me she was sorry about what happened. She said the whole situation was ridiculous and that I had been genuinely helpful to both the staff and the families. She mentioned that 3 families had already called to complain about the poor service since I stopped helping, and that she and her colleague were considering looking for new jobs because the workload had become impossible. I thanked her for the kind words and told her I hoped things would get better for everyone there. When I walked to my car, I felt a strange mix of frustration and relief. Getting fired was never fun, but at least I wouldn't have to watch grieving families suffer because of Karen's ridiculous management style anymore. 2 months later, I ran into the other family service advisor at a coffee shop. She told me that both she and her colleague had quit within a month of my firing. The complaints from families kept pouring in, and the general manager had tried to hire a temp to cover the phones and door, but the temp quit after 3 days of receiving contradictory instructions. The cemetery was now struggling to maintain basic customer service, and several families had taken their business elsewhere. For about 15 years now, I've worked in food quality control and seen all kinds of attitudes from plant managers and supervisors. Some are grateful for the help, others see me as a necessary evil. But this one guy took it to a whole different level. My job as quality control manager meant I traveled between 4 different food production plants in our region. I'd inspect everything from the actual food production lines to storage areas, employee facilities, and anything else that could potentially affect food safety. The company took this seriously because one contamination incident could shut us down permanently and destroy people's trust in our products. The plant in question was one of our smaller facilities, but it produced a significant portion of our packaged goods. I've been inspecting it for about 3 years, and the supervisor there had always been a bit defensive about my visits. He was one of those old-school guys who'd been with the company for decades and thought he knew everything there was to know about running a plant. On this inspection day, everything inside the facility looked good. The production lines were clean, employees were following proper hygiene protocols, temperatures were within acceptable ranges, and the product quality samples I took all passed testing. I was actually preparing to give them one of their better reports. When I was wrapping up my inspection, I noticed something concerning. The employee parking lot was in absolutely terrible condition. We're talking potholes deep enough to swallow a tire, loose gravel everywhere, and patches of dirt where the asphalt had completely worn away. Every time a car drove through, it kicked up massive clouds of dust that drifted toward the building. The real problem was that the main entrance to the plant was directly adjacent to this parking lot. The dust from vehicles was clearly making its way into the facility, especially when employees were coming and going during shift changes. I could actually see a fine layer of dust settling on some of the equipment near the entrance. This wasn't just a cosmetic issue. Food contamination from environmental dust is a serious health hazard and a major violation of federal food safety regulations. I knew the United States Department of Agriculture inspectors would have a field day with this if they saw it. I finished my inspection and prepared my report. Everything else was great, but I had to document the parking lot issue as a potential contamination hazard. I made sure to note that while the plant was operating well overall, this needed immediate attention before it became a bigger problem. I found the supervisor in his office and handed him the report. I told him that his inspection report was ready and that overall his team was doing a great job in the facility. He seemed pleased to hear this and asked if there were any issues he needed to know about. I explained that there was just one thing he needed to address. The parking lot was creating a dust contamination risk, and I recommended getting it repaved or at least stabilized before the USDA inspector made their next visit. I pointed out the specific section in my report that detailed this concern. He flipped through the pages until he found my note about the parking lot, and his face immediately changed. He became defensive and argued that I was there to inspect food production, not the parking lot. I explained that I was there to ensure the quality of the food products that left his plant and that the parking lot dust was a direct contamination risk. He dismissed my concerns completely, using some colorful language to express his disagreement. Then he said the words that every quality control manager both loves and dreads hearing. He told me flat out not to tell him how to run his plant. I just nodded and packed up my things. There's no point in arguing with someone who's made up their mind. I'd done my job by documenting the issue. What happened next was up to him and the regulators. 6 weeks later, I got a call from corporate. The USDA inspector had made their routine visit to the plant and immediately shut it down. The citation was exactly what I predicted: environmental contamination risk from the parking lot dust entering the food production area. The plant stayed closed for 2 weeks while they scrambled to get the parking lot repaved and bring everything up to code. 2 weeks of zero production, dozens of employees temporarily out of work, and thousands of dollars in lost revenue. All because the supervisor didn't want to spend a weekend getting the parking lot fixed. Even after the lot was repaved and the inspector approved the plan to reopen, there had been such a simple solution that could have prevented the shutdown entirely. The next month, when I made my regular inspection visit, the supervisor barely acknowledged me, but I had to ask him something. I mentioned that I'd been thinking about the whole parking lot situation and wondered about something. He asked what I was thinking about, clearly not thrilled to be discussing it. I suggested that he could have simply closed the parking lot temporarily and had employees park on the street instead. He could have scheduled the repaving for a weekend and kept the plant running the whole time. He just stared at me for a long moment. The solution was so obvious, so simple, and would have cost a fraction of what the shutdown ended up costing the company. But he'd been so focused on proving that I couldn't tell him how to run his plant that he'd missed the easy way out. He responded stiffly that they had handled the situation the way they needed to. I just acknowledged his answer and said I was simply curious about the alternatives. That was pretty much the end of our professional relationship. He stopped talking to me during my visits, communicated only through written reports, and generally made it clear that he blamed me for the shutdown. From his perspective, I suppose I was the guy who caused all the trouble by pointing out a problem he didn't want to acknowledge. The funny thing is, he didn't get fired. He didn't even get demoted. He worked for the company for another 8 years and retired with full benefits. I guess management figured the lesson was learned and the cost of the shutdown was punishment enough. The shutdown wasn't my fault for pointing out the problem. It was his fault for ignoring a simple solution because his pride got in the way. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.